Good afternoon and good morning, depending on where you are joining us from today. My name is Amy Berman, and I am the Deputy Director of the National Academy of Education. And on behalf of the Academy, I want to take a moment to thank you all for joining us today. I want to thank all of our panelists for their hard work and important contributions to this area. I want to thank the Spencer Foundation for funding this project, for our dedicated NAEd steering committee. I want to thank Susanna Loeb, our moderator, and our IT staff for making sure that this happens today. Before I turn this over to Susanna, I just want to put out a couple of sort of ground rules that we have going on. All of the attendees are muted by default. Later on, when we have our question and answer session, if you raise your hand during it, we can call on you and ask you to unmute yourself so that you can ask a question. You can also leave questions in the Q&A box, which is in the bottom corner of your screen. Please feel free to start putting questions in there as soon as they're coming to you so that we are sure to get to them during that portion of it. You saw as you were coming into this that we are planning on recording this and posting it on our website afterwards. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Susanna Loeb, who's the director of the Annenberg Institute and professor of education and international and public affairs at Brown University. Thank you.
Hello, thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Amy, and also thank you to the National Academy of Education for holding this forum, and to its president, Gloria Lansing-Billings, and to Michael Foyer, who, as the committee chair, organized the effort to address education issues during this time of the COVID pandemic and of heightened recognition of anti-Black racism. So, why are we here? The pandemic has led to unprecedented changes in schooling and in learning. In response, the National Academy of Education convened roundtables with over a dozen practitioners and researchers in order to understand challenges on the ground and to draw on relevant research for developing strategies to overcome those challenges. The Academy has posted a summary report from these discussions on its website, which you can see and access. Today, what we have is a subset of the roundtable on reading, to share tips and insights and to help lead a discussion about the best steps forward. So let me introduce them to you. We have two educators and practitioners bringing the teacher and policymaker perspective to our discussion. First, we have Deborah Cromer, who is the immediate past president of the Wisconsin State Reading Association. Thank you for being here, Deborah. Second, we have Robin Hall, who is the Director of Language Arts and Literacy at the Council of the Great City Schools. Wonderful to have you here, Robin. We also have two educators and scholars on the panel. First, we have Catherine Snow, who is the Patricia Algerg Graham Professor of Education at Harvard University. And second, we have Gigi, who is an Associate Professor of Educational and Counseling Psychology at McGill University. Thank you both for joining us. Before we move into their presentations and into the discussion to follow, I wanted to give you a quick overview of the roundtable from which today's discussions emerged. Our goal for the roundtable on reading was to identify both challenges to learning that the pandemic has brought on for students' reading development and promising approaches for addressing these challenges. In particular, we asked the participants to consider the following four questions. First, what inequities in reading have been exacerbated by the pandemic? Second, what are the biggest challenges for addressing unfinished curricular learning in reading instruction? Third, what strategies are you using or do you recommend that may be best bets for reading learning? And finally, if schools continue online learning, what are promising strategies for successful learning? The discussion that we had in the roundtables brought into focus stark inequities in learning that likely have been exacerbated by the pandemic. The uneven access to remote learning tools, to high-speed internet, desirable study space, and family supports further deepened the opportunity gaps that had already existed. As an example, in-home broadband adoption is lowest in the communities with the highest levels of poverty. Second, while in-person learning is crucial for most students, some students are particularly disadvantaged by the online learning environment. In particular, online learning is difficult, which might be expected, for younger children, for children with disabilities and special learning needs, and for dual language learners. Third, prior to the pandemic, absenteeism and school disengagement was a problem for many students. Online learning can actually be most difficult for these marginalized students, and as a result, the pandemic has likely increased disengagement and potentially increased dropping out of high school for these students. Barriers to effective communication with families and caregivers during the pandemic likely exacerbated these problems and caused additional stress on teachers and on students. Overall, we have a lot to think about, re-engaging students in school and addressing the range of experiences that students have had over the past 6 months and continue to have this fall. So today we'd like to think about what we can do to overcome these difficulties and give students the supports that they need overall and for reading development in particular. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to start with 10-minute presentations, and I really think they're wonderful presentations. First from Deborah Cromer, then Robin Hall, then Catherine Snow, then Gigi Look. Then we'll move into a 15-minute discussion among the panelists. I'll ask a few questions and then they will talk. I think we can learn a lot from the discussions that they'll have, and then we'll end with a 30-minute question and answer period. During that time, the National Academy staff will read the questions from the question and answer box, but you can also raise your hand, as you can do in Zoom, and ask questions directly. It should be a terrific session. And with this, let's begin the heart of the program. Deborah, you're up.
Good afternoon, or morning, as the case may be. As Susanna said, my name is Deborah Cromer, and I'm immediate past president of the Wisconsin State Reading Association. I've been a teacher for over 40 years, most of them working in rural, small-town schools. Thank you to the National Academy of Education for this opportunity to speak and to learn from and with the other panelists and webinar participants. Pre-pandemic, a vast array of inequities have plagued our society, inequities that COVID-19 certainly has exacerbated. Those same inequities exist in schools and adversely affect literacy instruction for students in many vulnerable groups. Students living in poverty, students of color, students who are socially isolated in and out of school, students with limited or no access to technology, students dealing with trauma. The list goes on and on. I am deeply concerned about each individual student who has been impacted by these inequities and by the changes to schooling due to the pandemic. I'd like to focus my opening remarks, though, on literacy teaching and learning at the intersection of the pandemic's effect on schools and classrooms as intellectual communities in which students and teachers think and learn together so that we can apply our literacies to read our worlds, compose our lives, and realize our humanity. When we human beings read and write for meaningful purposes and audiences, when we read and write to identify and work to solve problems, when we read and write in order to do important work in the world, when trusted adults and peers pay attention to and respond to our thinking, literacy learning can be accelerated for both students and teachers. Being a part of an intellectual community gives readers and writers opportunities to discover our strengths and build upon them to address our needs, whatever those needs may be. We must recognize that there have been classrooms and schools in which students and teachers have not been engaged as members of intellectual communities, places where students have been seen through a deficit lens rather than being valued as resources for their own learning and the learning of the classroom and school. Acknowledging and understanding that this was the reality before the pandemic is critically important as we begin a new school year under extraordinary circumstances. Peter Johnston, author of Choice Words and Opening Minds, and co-author with 6 Wisconsin teachers of the recently published Engaging Literate Minds, once said in the Wisconsin State Reading Association monograph, RTI at the Crossroads, response to intervention can be a welcomed and productive change or a recipe for disaster. So too can what's happening in the education system due to the pandemic. We can continue to widen the opportunity gaps by denying students their rightful places as part of the community of learners. Or we can seize this opportunity to ensure that every student is a valued member of an intellectual community by finding ways to notice, name, and support all children to apply what they have learned outside of school to the reading, writing, and thinking that we do in whatever form school is taking, so that we work together to make our world a better place. Changes in schooling disrupted the learning communities that were in existence, and it made it even harder to develop learning communities in classrooms and schools where they did not exist in the first place. As the executive summary of the 2020 National Academy of Education report, Reaping the Rewards of the Reading for Understanding Initiative says, we witness the most impressive effects when we see strong and supportive professional learning communities that hold high standards and provide continuous support in the form of coaching and careful monitoring to help teachers acquire practices that promote the widest student engagement in higher order talk within intentionally collaborative discussions about interesting and thought-provoking text, all moving toward a target of applying what students learn in such a process to some issue, problem, or project worth addressing. This summary concludes with these words. Next, please. The Reading for Understanding Initiative taught us about how much it takes to achieve even small effects for increases in student reading comprehension and performance. It is a matter of commitment and sustenance. With so many different types of instruction in place at the beginning of this year, and so much uncertainty about how schools will look as the year goes on, with many students having limited or no internet access to virtual classrooms, with research that identifies problems associated with the development of trust in virtual meetings for those who can attend, with social distancing and protective measures in place in classrooms that are face-to-face, will teachers, students, and schools be able to create the kinds of intellectual communities that nurture all readers, writers, and learners, especially the most vulnerable? Wisconsin principal Matt Renwick wrote in his newsletter, Reading by Example, about a survey conducted in his district, which asked families what they wanted to happen as schools moved to virtual or blended learning due to the pandemic. Here are their top 5 responses. Facilitate student discussion. Develop authentic learning experiences. Proactively communicate and engage with students and families. Communicate clear expectations and demonstrations. Offer voice and choice within structure. This survey gives us important ideas to consider as we begin this school year. There is another group of stakeholders to consult as well, who can provide food for thought about the kinds of issues, problems, or projects worth addressing as the Reading for Understanding Initiative recommends. In an interview with Lisa Ling entitled 6 Top Questions About COVID-19, What a Child Psychiatrist Has to Say, Harvard psychiatrist Vikram Patel said, "What's really of great concern to me is the complete absence of young people's voices in this conversation. I have yet to see a compelling survey that has asked children, how do you feel That question provides a possible starting place for our reading, writing, and thinking together this year. What if we create intellectual communities in which students and teachers read, write, discuss, and think together about how to survive and thrive in this changing world of ours? What might students and teachers do together in that kind of learning community? Here are some possibilities to consider. Notice and name what students have been learning during the pandemic. Keep track of what they are noticing and thinking about, what they're wondering about, what they want and need to learn in order to cope with this changing world. Ask students what they think teachers need to learn during this time of uncertainty. Conduct an inquiry into how their school has changed. Conduct an inquiry into how their community has changed. In Deep Learning, Engage the World, Change the World, published in 2017, Michael Fullen, Joanne Quinn, and Joanne McEachin write, "The need for change and the opportunity to take action are converging. The old system works only for a minority, and those who succeed are not all that well off either when it comes to living in increasingly complex times." What's interesting is that the new set of crises is forcing humankind to reconsider its relationship to each other and to the planet and universe. The circumstances that now face us represent a unique configuration of challenges that make it essential that we proactively change the world through learning. Deep learning, then, is about finding our place in a complex, indeed scary world. It is about transforming our reality through learning, both individually and collectively. Next, please. Today, may we consider the context and purposes of literacy learning, reflect upon what resources students and educators bring to school, as well as upon the inequities in our educational system, and learn from this crisis how to reimagine schooling and take action for meaningful change together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deborah. Hearing from a former teacher speak that way about student voices is so incredibly heartening. I'm going to turn it over to Robin Hall now.
Thank you, Susanna, and thank you, Deborah, for such a thought-provoking presentation. I am Robin Hall, Director of Language Arts and Literacy with the Council of the Great City Schools, and I'd like to thank the National Academy of Education for inviting me to join in this important forum on reading instruction. It is my hope that the insights and perspectives that I share today will provide actionable steps in mitigating the substantial impact of this pandemic on the learning trajectory of students in reading and across the content areas. A little bit about myself: I was born into a family of educators, and despite my declaration that I would never be a teacher, destiny prevailed, and I passionately served in public education for over 30 years. And as we talk about the inequities of COVID-19 and reading instruction, it is important to reiterate, just as what Deborah said, the inequities that already exist in this area and that are exacerbated by this pandemic. Next slide, please. To be sure, the current health crisis has caused an unprecedented disruption in education. Districts not only need to address the significant social and emotional toll that COVID-19 has taken on students, families, and staff, but especially in the instructional challenges posed by school closures in early reading. This prolonged interruption in schooling, as we have heard over the last few months, continues to have a greater adverse impact on students with disabilities, English learners, students who are homeless or in transitional living situations, or students who are homeless or in transition, or students from low-income backgrounds who receive free or reduced price meals through school and or may not have access to computers to engage in virtual learning. These issues must be recognized, and schools will need to attend to the emotional well-being of students as they re-engage them in the reading process as well as other academic content. So for the purpose of this discussion, I will frame my comments around the topics of reading instruction and grade level literacy attainment, unfinished learning, and student access to grade level learning. Next. First, we know that the living conditions of our students vary significantly. Even with the provision of resources such as internet connection, digital devices, and a variety of print materials, the student's ability to successfully use them during instructional time will depend on the kind of support they have at home. And many students may not have a guide by the side to support instruction during synchronous and asynchronous learning time. Next. These kinds of circumstances will greatly limit or even prevent many of the marginalized and most vulnerable students from accessing quality reading instruction, including many of the learning experiences listed on this slide. These are essential to ensuring equitable learning experiences for all students. My concern is that students would require support and scaffolding from their teachers as they read text, and they will be in danger of regressing and are given up altogether without the proper intervention. Next slide. Second, the issue of addressing unfinished learning or learning loss has commanded the attention of the public at large and pretty much drives the instructional agenda for our school districts. So learning loss has morphed into sort of a life of its own. But as we all know, unfinished learning is a natural part of the teaching and learning process. It is the ebb and flow of a student's learning progression as they matriculate through their courses. However, next slide, all too often, unfinished learning leads to remediation or pull-out interventions that serve to further isolate students and impede their access to rigorous, engaging, grade-level content. This is how something as natural as unfinished learning leads to intractable achievement and opportunity gaps. So addressing unfinished learning in a constructive manner is therefore essential, not only to a district's short-term response to the current pandemic, but long-term commitment to educational equity and excellence. Next. So this cartoon illustrates what I call the crux of the matter. And if you will just indulge me, for those of you who may not be able to see the cartoon, I will read it to you in my teacher voice. So a young man has come to a library and he's checking out a book. Can I check out this book? Yes, you can check out any book, the media specialist responds. Any book, the child asks? If you can reach it, you can check it out. What if I can't reach it, the child asks? Then I'll do it for you, responds the librarian. My teacher says I need to return this book. It's above my reading level. And the librarian responds, so? And the child responds, so I can't read it. Maybe you can, maybe you can't, maybe you can't read part of it, maybe you just want to look at the pictures. You can still keep it. The child responds, forever? The librarian, no. The child is thinking, worth a shot. So the teacher returns with the student asking, did you tell this student he should check out this book? And so, are you aware it's well above his reading level? And the librarian responds, don't care. Teacher, we have a policy. Librarian, I love the sound policy makes when I break it. Teacher, I'm very disappointed in you. I'm very disappointed you let kids check out just any book. Librarian, why? Which books did you want to censor? What? No, I just want to make sure they read within their capabilities. Librarian, and I want them to know that they have no limits. Clearly here, this cartoon prompts us, or should anyway, to question our beliefs about the children we teach every day and about ourselves as educators. Do we believe that all students can learn to read on grade level with the appropriate supports and scaffolding? Do we have the skill and the will to do what is necessary to help them become literate and actually experience the joy of reading? The rubber meets the road here. Mindsets, beliefs, judgments that teachers and educators have about the children they serve in terms of what they can and cannot do based on their own bias must be confronted. Next. So with this in mind, the council developed a resource entitled Addressing Unfinished Learning Amid the COVID-19 School Closures. And it offers these overarching principles in order to ensure that all students have equal access to high quality instruction and educational opportunity. Next slide, please. Teachers should ensure that all students have the opportunity to engage in Tier 1 instruction, allowing them sufficient time to make sense of a task or a problem before intervening. In reading, they should also, when students stumble over unfamiliar words or have difficulty understanding the text, don't retreat to less demanding or simplified text. Next slide. Districts should also avoid the temptation to rush over and to cover all of the gaps in learning from last school year. The pace required to cover all of this content would mean rushing ahead of many students, leaving them abandoned and discouraged. Next slide. Typically, reading basals include 6 units per grade level with text and activities selected and organized around themes. So with this in mind, districts should consider the fact that students may get a lot more from working closely on 10 units than on 18. This prioritization of content and learning would not only promote in-depth, rigorous instruction, but allow for the additional time teachers will need to address unfinished learning needs as they arise. Next slide. Teachers should also resist the inclination, or district leaders in curriculum and instruction should resist the inclination to water down instruction and assignments for students with specialized learning needs. Removing students from core instruction in an attempt to remediate or catch them up is not only counterproductive, it significantly contributes to the widening of the opportunity gap and often results in students being tracked or grouped into lower grade level and core classes. Ensuring inclusion during this time of virtual learning is vital to providing continuity of quality teaching and learning experiences for all students. Next, districts should approach assessments as temperature checks, a thermometer that can identify when someone has a fever, but it takes a doctor armed with this data to probe further and identify what's causing the fever and how to restore the patient to health. Similarly, teachers should use assessment results to alert them to the fact that students have unfinished learning, but it is ultimately left up to the teacher to identify whether gaps in essential learning exist and what additional scaffolding and support is required. Next. So whatever differences exist in the experiences and resulting academic needs of children during this crisis, it must not be the starting point for instruction in the coming year. Rather, as educators, we should capitalize on the shared experience of living through a pandemic as well as the more recent social justice protest movement as a learning opportunity. The virus, school closures, social distancing, and nationwide protests have created new common experiences that can serve as a basis for the work across subjects in the first weeks of school. This will allow schools and teachers to re-engage students directly, address student and adult hardship, stress, or trauma, and resume instruction in a way that feels contextualized and responsive, helping students to comprehend the world around them. And I'd like to close with this quote from Brian Stevenson. Intuitively, we all like to seek the things that are comfortable rather than uncomfortable. But I do think there is a way of saying that if I believe in justice, and I believe that justice is a constant struggle, and if I want to create justice, then I have to get comfortable with that struggle. And so I invite us all to really discuss and come together around this issue of inequity in reading instruction during this pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robin. You gave us a lot to think about there. I'm going to turn it over to Catherine Snow now.
Thank you. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Susanna. And thank you to the panelists who preceded me, because you said so much good stuff that I can cut a lot out of what I was going to say. Let me just introduce myself for those who don't know me. I am coming at this as a researcher, but a researcher who has been involved over the last 20 years in a couple of different very generative partnerships with school districts, with practitioners, from whom I have learned an enormous amount. One of those partnerships is currently going on with the Early Childhood Department of the Boston Public Schools, where young children are not in school. 5-year-olds are not, but 4-year-olds, many 4-year-olds are. And with the Strategic Education Research Partnership, where I've collaborated to develop various resources, some of which I'll give you links to later in this talk, resources that have now been converted for online access in some cases. Next. So let me start with some concessions and confessions. I am a researcher, but there is not a lot of research that's directly relevant to either online learning or missed or postponed learning in the domain of literacy. There's somewhat more for math, but we have to struggle on and draw conclusions as best we can. And secondly, and this is echoing the National Academy report, summary report, social and mental health issues almost certainly need attention before the cognitive and learning issues can be addressed. So obviously that's something that practitioners have constantly in front of mind. But what I can talk about, next slide, is some big specific to literacy issues. And next, I'm going to focus on 4 specific issues that are, I think, particular to literacy, although not peculiar to literacy. One, how different the tasks of teaching and learning to read and write are in different different grade levels. Secondly, the degree of within-class heterogeneity, particularly in grades K to 2, when some kids are already reading on their own and some are, don't even know the difference between B and D, but also increasingly in adolescence, as some kids have progressed as expected, and others are still struggling with very early grade skills. Thirdly, that there are particular learning trajectories. I mean, of course, we're always talking about learning trajectories, but a lot of learning trajectories are defined by the curriculum, the scope and sequence of the curriculum. In the domain of literacy, and to some extent in math, skills are acquired in sequence because they are prerequisites to other skills. So it's really important not to skip over those prerequisite skills as we think about how to focus our teaching. And then finally, the distinction, the important distinction between teaching, what we have to support students with, and learning, the activities they can engage in which they are growing and developing in the domain of literacy, perhaps with guidance from teachers, but not as a result of direct teaching. And of course, in the domain of literacy, the big issue here is getting kids to read and read a lot. Something they can do on their own, they can do with support if they have people to talk to about what they're reading, but that doesn't need sort of teacher-fronted instruction. So I'll talk about each of those a little more extensively. The next slide lays out what a very schematic developmental view of reading and the kind of major tasks, learning and teaching tasks in each of the grade spans. And in the K to second grade span, clearly grasping, getting someone to explain to you the alphabetic principle is pretty important, and also having the practice that will enable automaticity and fluency, real mastery of the alphabetic principle. In subsequent grades, lots of reading is crucial to develop automaticity, fluency, vocabulary, and familiarity with the various topics that will be the stuff of schooling in later years. In grades 5 to 8, we are now expecting that students will develop content knowledge through reading, but they often need guidance to do that because they don't really understand what the task is. And in grades 8 to 16, much more challenging disciplinary specific literacy skills are required. The next slide makes the simple point that some of these are absolutely crucial prerequisites to later skills. So if kids don't master the alphabetic principle, then they read with mistakes, without accuracy, they read slowly, and they cannot expose themselves to the vast volume of text that that would be most desirable to ensure they get access to lots of information and lots of vocabulary and lots of points of view that would be available if they were reading more widely. If kids in the early years, the preschool and early years of school, are not given access to general knowledge, then they will have lots of struggles understanding content area texts that they were expected to read in 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade. If they don't know what volcanoes are, if they don't know what legislatures are, if they don't understand domains of knowledge like that, then reading about those domains of knowledge becomes much more challenging. They need exposure to academic language because later grades text is full of particular written language structures that can absolutely block comprehension if kids don't know it, haven't learned it, haven't been exposed to it. And of course, critical thinking is crucial if kids are going to succeed at the tasks we expect them to do in the later elementary and secondary grades, reading critically, reading analytically, reading comparatively. The next slide shows, or just is simply meant to point out that there is a lot of heterogeneity within any of these developmental epochs in the level of skills kids display, and that's the great challenge for teachers, that they have to respond to the kids in their classrooms as individuals and not as representatives of the grade level that they're supposed to be at. And I think this is perhaps one opportunity of this era of distanced and remote teaching and learning, that perhaps it will be possible to personalize or utilize purposeful skill-specific grouping for small group teaching in a way that is less stigmatizing than the pullouts that we are often reverting to in regular face-to-face classroom settings. Also, in the later grades, it's possible in remote teaching and learning to give kids things to read that they are more interested in rather than the universal text that we're all reading this year in 6th grade. And then the next slide is an effort to kind of make a point about teaching versus learning. There are things that kids absolutely desperately need to be taught. And most kids need some skilled teaching about the alphabetic principle because it's kind of hard to figure it out. And a well-trained teacher with a good curriculum can do a better job of that than just letting kids read and figure it out on their own. Academic language forms can be taught, how to make a good argument, the text structures they need in writing, the differences across the disciplines in text structures and argument structures. It's very helpful to kids to let them in on those secrets so they can grasp those key domains. But then mastering those domains really requires lots of practice and engagement in authentic tasks that generate a need to master them. And that's not a characteristic of all classrooms, but it is a characteristic of the classrooms where kids are doing a good job making progress in literacy. And that's one of the challenges to figure out how to do this in remote settings, partly because engaging in social contexts for learning can be very important for engaging in difficult tasks that would be too challenging for kids to use individually, and because discussion by itself is a great predictor of positive literacy outcomes. So next slide, there's a lot to teach and there's a lot to learn, but there are many kinds of skills in this domain. There are these constrained skills like the phoneme grapheme correspondences, or the vocabulary that's used in academic settings that can be taught directly and where mastery is achievable. And then there's the vast domains of background knowledge and how to write well, and how to make good arguments, and how to comprehend deeply, which are large problem spaces, no clear endpoint, they can't be easily assessed, and they just require a lot of time and practice. So it would be a mistake if in the distance learning era we concentrated on the constrained skills, because those can be done with apps or with worksheets, and ignored these unconstrained skills that need interaction, discussion, and sort of an expansive view of what learning is. Next slide. So as a researcher, I of course want to test some hypotheses about these things, and here are a few very straightforward ones that I'm afraid that we could probably all come up with. Distance teaching will exacerbate the social class differences in literacy achievement that we already see. I would argue that that exacerbation effect might be strongest for grades 1 and 2. Kids don't get good teaching about the alphabetic principle, they will be in trouble. And in grades 7 and 8, where the transition to much more challenging types of literacy tasks is happening. That students with grade level reading skills in grades 1 and 2 may not show negative effects. They may be able to just pick up books and read them and achieve mastery on their own. Obviously, I would hypothesize that parental involvement will diminish negative effects on students in all grades, but especially in the elementary grades. And then perhaps a somewhat controversial hypothesis that very good and avid readers will make greater progress in vocabulary, knowledge acquisition, and reading skill in general during periods of no or remote schooling than would be expected during normal schooling. Next slide. Here are some of the useful resources that you might be interested in. Some of these are resources about how to promote discussion in a distance learning setting when kids are not face-to-face in the classroom. And I've broken them out by developmental epoch, and also identified there the resources, the starry resources specifically for struggling readers. And there's an expert on STARI in the audience today, Margaret Troyer. So if you have questions, you can ask me and I'll bounce them to her. So thank you very much. I appreciate your attention and I look forward to your comments.
Thank you so much, Catherine. We really appreciate your participation. I'm turning it over to Gigi Luck now. Gigi, I think you're still on mute.
There you go. Can you guys hear me? Okay. Thank you. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. My name is Gigi Luck. I'm just going to briefly introduce myself. And I'm an associate professor at McGill University in Canada. And before I moved back to Canada, I worked in Massachusetts for about 8 years. And thank you, Deborah, Robin, and Catherine, giving us such an enriching, thought-provoking presentations before me so that I can hopefully share with you some of my thoughts for bilingual learners. But I have to say that even for bilingual learners, these challenges that they face during COVID-19 and this whole pandemic period is not unique to them. All learners face the same challenges, but they're disproportionately affected. Next, please. So this is a graph that I just captured a few days ago, looking at the cases in the last 7 days. There are a lot of talks about what would be the most appropriate measure for measuring the severity of the pandemic in the country. And in this graph, as you could see, some of the bordering states in California, Texas, and Florida has a lot more number of cases in the last few days, but that also depends on the number of testing. And coincidentally, some of these states also have the largest numbers of bilingual learners in the school system. Next, please. And of course, as Catherine said, we don't know a lot from research about COVID-19 and learning loss because this situation is unprecedented and there is no research evidence for us to base on. In a report released earlier this year by the Northwest Evaluation Association, they compare they projected the pandemic learning loss related to summer loss. So every year, children have a short period of time that they're not in school, and their learning tend to be worse during this period because there is no schooling happened. And so using data from previous years, NWEA predicted what it would be like in terms of the learning loss. So on your left, you can see the panel for mathematics separated by grade in different colors. Mid-March is roughly when the school closures occurred in North America. And the typical last day is what learning should look like on a typical school year, which is in the middle of June. And solid lines that you see here indicates the typical growth or summer loss. So every year during the summer, children's learning decrease slightly. And the thicker dotted lines indicates the COVID slowdown, and the lightest line actually indicate the COVID slide starting from the school closure. So from these graphs in mathematics and reading, we can see that the children who are the youngest will experience the largest learning loss, and because they're still in the moment of developing their learning skills and a lot of the content knowledge. And compared to mathematics, reading experienced a slightly less reading loss, but as Catherine pointed out, a lot of the foundational skills that we need to be successful in learning in later grades are built up on learning skills in the earlier grades. Next. Next. So for English learners, there are three, sorry, can you go back to the last slide? So for English learners, there are 3 points that I want to ensure to promote for their learning during COVID-19. at this moment, we have to step back and think about the learners as the center of unit. So we should focus on their socioeconomic backgrounds because this is deeply confounded to their access to instruction when most of the instruction are being delivered online. And the second point is that the support for educators is not sufficient for them to adequately address the learning needs for these children, particularly when the instruction is delivered in a second language of the learners that they're still learning. And the third point is, instead of looking at the learning loss, we can also look at what kind of strength that bilingual students have and leverage those strengths to help with what they're losing. Next, please. So using Massachusetts data from 2018-19 years, I looked at whether English proficiency confounded with economic disadvantage. So in this graph, these are called mosaic plot, and the pink area you see indicate the proportion of students who are eligible to be in the economic disadvantage category, and the blue area indicates that they're not. And over the three graphs here in grade 3, 5, and 8, the broader, the wider column indicates that they have never been an English learners or former English learners. And in this case, you can see that for the children who are current English learners, the large majority of them are in the economic disadvantage categories. And this pattern persists across the 3 grades. Next. And so when we think about socioeconomic status, and we have to think about what are the daily challenges that children learn besides their learning loss. One thing for sure is the home environment become more financially uncertain or chaotic. And one consequence of the financial uncertainty is food insecurity. And according to Feeding America, food insecurity indicates that a household's inability to provide enough food for every person to live an active, healthy lifestyle. In 2020, up to today, the projected number of people who will be affected by food insecurity is 54 million in the United States, of which 18 million of them are children. And in a snapshot of report, in a project that I collaborated with my colleagues, Anna Johnson and Deborah Phillips in Georgetown University, we asked over 500 families in Tulsa, Oklahoma, how their life has been during the COVID. In this survey, we found that close to 50% of the family respondents stated that they have lost their job or seen a decrease in the work hours, leading to a decrease in household income. And close to 50% of them also experience food insecurity. Close to 60% have experienced a decrease in household income in general. And to think about the daily struggle of putting food on the table, as simple as that, also leads to increased mental health struggle as well for this family. Next. And as mentioned before, there has been a lot of awareness and recognition that now the instruction and access to information is all digital, in-home broadband internet access is very important. But unfortunately, this is also one of the confounding factors in which broadband adoption is the lowest in communities with highest level of poverty. So when learning only confined to one mode of delivery, those who don't have access to this delivery will struggle. And when we asked teachers in Tulsa, Oklahoma, that 90% of the teachers actually reported that they are somewhat challenging and very challenging to collaborate with parents to support learning at home. And this is from a teacher's perspective. And we know that English learners, especially those who are long-term English learners, has a large percentage of them experience in absenteeism and also drop out. And so during this period, the expectation is that these proportion of students will increase because they lack access to instruction. Next. So when delivering instruction for English learners, we know that it's very awkward to learn from Zoom. There is a lot of missing information in the social interaction. And for second language learning, this is definitely a very painful experience. And in the teacher force, we also know that most of the teachers and educators in general mostly speak English. And they don't speak the language that the children speak. And so when we asked teachers who interact with English learners in Tulsa, Oklahoma, up to 32% of them said it's very challenging to work with students who are English learners. And 46 of them say they're somewhat challenging. So with this combined 78% of teachers reporting it's challenging to work with these students, only 20% of them reported receiving guidance and support to provide accommodation for English learners. Next. So if we think about bilingual students and English learners in particular, they face a double challenge in academic success even before the pandemic. They are destined to learn academic content through a developing second language, and it is not an easy task. But we have also to think about what they have at home, what their strengths are, instead of concentrating on the deficit, so that we can leverage their strength to help with their growing areas of concern. So language is the foundation of literacy. Before we know how to read, we know how to speak. And strong research evidence suggested that knowing another language is not going to impede development in English. And so ensuring that children have meaningful delivery of instruction in their second language is very important, but we can also leverage what they have at home, which is more time to stay at home with their parents, so that we can think about what are the ways that we can engage with them in literacy and language activities for younger children that are meaningful for them in their home environments. Up to now, there is not a lot of research reporting what is the home learning environment is like for these children. We don't know if they have their own space and sit down to quietly learn like they do in school, or they may have siblings running around. And the challenges that we faced can be separated into short-term, medium-term, and long-term. For the short-term, we need to think about how to provide equitable access to instructions and support educators. And we also need to think about how to build relationship with families in the new school year without the in-person interaction. In the medium term, maintaining engagement through the semester or even academic year with limited in-person schooling is key. In the long term, we have to think about a paradigm shift in equitable assessment and teacher preparation for an increasingly diverse population. Next. And to think about equity in education, equity in a system needs societal investment. And now during this time, when we shift learning from school to home that relies on family resources, we're experiencing or seeing evidence of exacerbating inequity. And so when the discussion of equity is during normacy is underlooked, under-focused, it is that kind of conversation that will prepare us for this kind of time. And so next, thank you very much. And I look forward to a discussion.
Trying to get myself back up here. Thank you all. That was really terrific. I just wanted to remind all the people who are listening that you can put a question in the Q&A box, as well as raise your hand for questions that we'll have in this discussion. I'll just start us off, but then as you have questions, I'm very much happy just to add them in there. So as an initial question, right now we have this really unstable schooling with social distance, students sometimes in person, sometimes online, and all that changing day to day. I'm interested in what schools and districts should be focused on so that they can provide the best reading teaching for students and reduce the negative effects on reading. Are there some trade-offs that you think schools need to grapple with in helping students What are those trade-offs, and how would you advise schools and districts when they're thinking, should I do this or should I do that? What are some key trade-offs?
Well, let me attempt that. I mean, obviously, this is the problem, that we want to do everything, and particularly now we've got less time and fewer resources, so we have to be very judicious. And my colleague Jal Mehta talks about this as an opportunity to Marie Kondoize the curriculum, to throw out all that stuff that's in there because some member of some standards committee thought it should be, rather than because it is a central need of growing readers, of developing students. And I think there are obvious ways to do that in the content areas, in later grades, in early literacy instruction. And I look forward to what the actual literacy educators here have to say about this, but they just can't get away from ensuring that kids can read words accurately and fluently, because if they can't do that by the end of 2nd or 3rd grade, they're going to struggle in every other domain of reading. So, and yet it would be a huge disaster to do only that, right? I mean, doing that for 2 hours a day is the best and surest way to turn kids off reading. We must not forfeit opportunities to talk about what kids are reading, opportunities to read aloud to them and discuss what's read aloud, opportunities for them to write or draw pictures or talk to each other about what they're reading. But at the same time, there does need to be that core instruction targeted on the skills that are most crucial.
I definitely agree, Catherine. There are a lot of districts grappling with that very issue now, in terms of making sure that the students in pre-K and through 2nd grade up to 3rd grade are really able to get the foundational skills instruction that they need. And some of the strategies and some of the approaches that are being used is to actually send packets of certain booklets home, so that when teachers are engaging students in synchronous instruction, that the students actually have books in hand as they read through them. The issue, which really troubles me, is that, you know, I just watching, you know, the progression of I have a 3-year-old grandson and a 2-year-old grandson, and his attention span, when you think about the attention span of pre-K at 4, you know, 5, there has to be some, as I say, guide by the side. There has to be some support to help keep them focused, to help explain. So that's the thing that really, even with the best ways to try to put decodable text in the home, there are teachers that are pre-recording lessons where the students can follow along. I just worry about the support, the variability of support across the homes for students to be able to really benefit from all of the creative things districts and teachers are doing to try to get that foundational skills instruction to the kids.
I absolutely agree that we have to address foundational skills, and especially in grades K2. But I also agree that we have to make sure that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, that we do that kind of differentiated instruction for those that need it in the context of reading for meaning, for understanding, for enjoyment, for engagement, for meaningful purposes, so that children see why they're doing the kinds of tasks that we give them, but why they need to read and write in the first place. And I say write because I think writing is one of those ways in to some of those foundational skills for classrooms in large groups, as well as working on foundational skills with small groups and individuals that need it. And I think that when we start with where children are, what they're thinking, what they're feeling about this changing world of ours, we can do a lot of that skills work based on what we see them bringing to the table. P. David Pearson, who is a member of this academy, said at a conference of the Wisconsin State Reading Association a number of years ago, children are who they are, they know what they know, they bring what they bring, they are not instructional inconveniences. We need to make sure that we address what they need when they need it, but we need to make sure that we are not turning them off from reading and writing when we focus on those more constrained skills, that we always have in mind that there's a reason why they're doing it, and we want to keep them engaged and help them feel confident and competent moving forward.
Can I just reinforce that by saying, I think one of the advantages of using writing as invented spelling and writing as a way in writing is that it's automatically personalized.
Yeah.
Kids do it at the level that they can do it.
Absolutely.
Do something that might be way beyond or way below some of them.
Right. It values their thinking, but it pushes their knowledge of foundational skills along at the same time. Win-win, I think.
Right.
Just building on this, there's a question where from the audience where it says, I'm curious how schools and teachers are ensuring that they are keeping young children's attention virtually all day. And I think you just touched on that a little with sending some materials home, by integrating these different approaches. Do you have, I just wanted to make sure we didn't lose that while it's there. Do you have any other tips?
Well, you know, there have many districts, some of our member districts at the council have, in some of our conversations have stated that, you know, screen time has been an issue. You know, how long do we require students to participate in remote learning? How long is, so okay, I lost my thought, Susanna. What did you ask me?
Oh, we're just how to engage students during this time.
So the way that they're engaging students is a lot of times with the screen time, they are now chunking the lessons so that students are able to get the input of the lesson, process, give them a task or something that to complete, listen to fluent reading. They're using breakout rooms with paraprofessionals that help students read along with the text and participate in discussion. So they're trying out different tools and ways to not only provide whole group instruction, but to pull the students in small groups to get more personalized instruction and engagement from the students.
I also want to add that we're now actually pushing all these young children to become college students overnight, almost, over the last few months. So there's a lot to learn there, how to organize your Google Drive, how to organize your documents, and these are all new for these students. I really like Robin's idea of sending writing packets or paper packets home, because that's one familiarity that reminiscent of the stability of a classroom learning. And technology can be used to supplement and enrich that. But don't forget that there are other means of delivering instructions as well.
Do any of you see any opportunities here that, you know, schools weren't perfect as they were before and we suddenly have shaken things up? What can we do now that we hadn't thought about that can really help students in any of these areas? Catherine, I loved how you laid out these different things that students need to know, the alphabetic knowledge and the critical thinking. And are there things that we can do now that schooling is a bit unstable that we hadn't been able to do before, but that could be helpful?
I would say that having worked for many years in an effort to promote discussion-based methods in classrooms and curricula that support discussion in classrooms, that it's rather hard because it's hard in whole classrooms for obvious reasons. Teachers have time constraints and they have they know the answer, and so it's hard to make it an authentic discussion when the kids are always turning to them and looking to see if they're getting it right or getting it wrong. And it can get noisy and it can get unruly. But I do think that creating small cooperative learning groups is something that one can do online, in a sense, more easily. And if the teacher isn't there, it can work. It can work. If there's a task to complete, you've got 25 minutes, you know, everybody solves this problem and then explain to each other how you solved it. Or each of you read a separate article about this topic and then come to a conclusion about it. And with very specific tasks and guidance about roles, that's an opportunity for kids to engage in authentic discussion that might be more authentic than what happens in classrooms when the teacher is always overhearing it.
And one of the things I saw happening, particularly this summer, when I was working with some students that I had started working with when schools closed in the spring, is that we have opportunities to involve families in ways that we never did before. They can observe our interactions with children. They can see how discussions can be facilitated. They can become a part of those discussions. That was what was happening with a student and his mom and me this summer. He had chosen to read a biography of Donald Driver, who is a former Green Bay Packer, for those of you who are not familiar with Wisconsin football. But we had a discussion about Driver's childhood in Houston and got into the history of got into segregated schools and the civil rights movement, and we went in depth, the three of us, in ways that certainly wouldn't have been possible if traditional schooling had been in place. Of course, he missed the interaction with his peers, but it was possible to have a parent involved in that discussion. But the opposite can happen too, and I think we need to look at situations where children are at home alone, and what opportunities we have when they are left because parents are working outside of the home and they are dealing with online instruction themselves. I think that it's essential for us to help them see what they are doing to help themselves to elevate their own personal learning and their strengths, and we can do that because we see the context if they choose to reveal it. We see the context in which they're living, and we can help them see what they are doing that is effective in moving them forward as readers, writers, and learners.
You know, Deborah, I agree wholeheartedly. And as you were speaking, I was thinking about the importance of students developing agency.
Yes.
I think that, you know, without having that teacher in the room, as you were mentioning, Catherine, and allowing for some authenticity there and organic conversations, I think about the fact that many times students are passive learners. You know, the teachers are doing all the work. They're making sure that I'm going to input. And now, if we can look at instruction in a way and design tasks in a way that helps build the muscle, the academic muscle of the children, the motivation, the initiative, the perseverance that's needed to really take on complex tasks, reading. I think if we kind of rethink ways we create tasks so that students can look at learning as something they own and not something that's being thrust upon them. I think it can elevate learning in ways that would really benefit the children.
That's terrific. I have two, before we leave, there are two good, really great questions that have come up. One is about remediation and this idea that we've always had students come to school with a variety of skills and knowledge, and we've used different approaches to it. Clearly, there are some problems with some of the traditional approaches, pulling students out that keep them from access to high-level material, all sorts of things like that. How should schools be thinking about addressing the variation in student needs and the prerequisite skills that you need to take the next step without getting into the problems of traditional remediation, and have it be more of an individual differentiation?
Well, I think I might have triggered this question, and it's a very good question because we know the dangers of differentiating instruction based on where students are and then leaving them there in those tracks for the rest of their lives. But I think particularly in this world, this slightly utopian world that Robin described, in which kids are taking more responsibility for their own learning and for self-teaching, as David Scher, the literacy theorist, talks about it. We have to make sure they have the tools to do the self-teaching. And so I would certainly endorse the idea that a first grader who hasn't got any idea about the alphabetic principle in a class full of kids who are already reading at first grade level might need some extra support. But I mean, I think the advantage is that student doesn't need to be pulled out of class visibly to do that. But that student should then also definitely not be separated from the rest of the class for activities like discussion of books being read aloud, or writing opportunities to do invented spelling and writing or composition. So as much together as possible, but very targeted small group or individual supplementary instruction, I think is particularly crucial in this time when these prerequisite skills are going to be more relied upon to enable progress.
Well, and one thing I saw happening, especially in the spring when schools closed, was that some of the students that I was working with were contacting me more through email or text and letting me know about areas of need. And they felt comfortable to do that because it was private. They didn't have to let everybody else in their class know that they were struggling with something. And by doing it in writing, that gave me a lot of information about what they knew and what they partially knew and what they needed to learn. But it gave me ways to really target my interaction with them in ways that did give them that agency, but also gave them they still felt a sense of belonging with their group because they were included with discussions, but they had a very individual, private way to relay their needs that didn't put them at risk of being shamed by their peers. And for some of the older students who were struggling, that was very much a concern to them.
Mm-hmm. The only challenge here, Deborah, is that we need to clone you.
I was just going to say that risk-free environment is so important.
Yeah, it is.
During the learning process. And I think grade level instruction with just-in-time scaffolds to help students to continue to grow in their skill attainment and knowledge attainment is something that can be done with the proper planning and with the support from the Curriculum and Instruction Office of support during professional development through the instructional units. We all know, especially in reading, areas where students tend to struggle. And there's always, I think I mentioned earlier, there's always going to be some unfinished learning in some area. And so sometimes it just takes just a redirection, just a little input, a little feedback that just keeps them along the continuum. So I think that as long as we continue to focus on their assets, what they're bringing to the class, and build on that and use that as a springboard for providing grade level instruction, while again filling in those gaps as you move through the learning progression, I think that students will be able to perform well and to gain the knowledge and skills they need.
So during this time, sorry, Deborah. During this time, we've clearly been dealing with virtual schooling and the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, but we've also been struck by our long-term pandemic of anti-Black racism in the US that's really come right into the center of many people's world right now. And one of the audience is interested in whether we have any statistics on the disproportional effect of COVID-19 on African-American students. And so I'm interested in that, but also how you see schools' role in combating anti-Black racism and helping students in reading in the face of what's been going on in the country.
Well, I think here again, there's an opportunity to build on the common experience that, people are witnessing across the country in terms of the social unrest, in terms of the injustices we have been seeing with these murders of Black men. And if we're able to enter into a conversation, talk about, create a space where we're actually reading literature. I mean, in terms of the amount of information and material that's out there that we can read and help students process is there. Students have very real feelings about what's going on. And I think, as educators, a lot of the civil rights movement started in schools and colleges, they started with college students. And so to give them to really be thoughtful about the history of this country and to provide a forum for discussion, I think is something that can help students process and to really respond in ways that can help us get to a place where we can have a conversation and be agents for change. I think, in schools, we teach children, but we're teaching them to what end? We want them to have a sense of identity. We want them to establish their own voice. We want them to equip them with the knowledge to help make this world a better place. And so we start there.
Right. That's why we were reading and writing in the first place, I think. And I you used some words that reminded me of 3.5 years ago, I was convention chair for our annual state convention, and one of the sessions titles I remembered late last night and found my convention program. It was Sarah Ahmed and Harvey Daniels, and the title of their session was From Identity to Inquiry, when the world hands us a curriculum. Well, the world has handed us several this year, and we do need to go from who students are, who they are as human beings, first of all, why they need to read and write individually, why we need to read and write and think and learn together, and start with their questions, start with what they're concerned about, what they don't know about. Some of the students that I've been working with recently live in rural Wisconsin where there's very little diversity, and yet they are reading the news, they are talking with their families about what is going on and trying to make sense of it, and to learn from it. And I think Gwen, Robin, as you said, I'm thinking of Gwen McMillan. I saw her on the list of participants, but I think that we really need to pull in all the resources that are there, the children's books, the picture books, the writing opportunities for students to let us know what they're thinking about all of this, and start there to dig in and to teach those skills that they need in the context of those reasons for becoming literate.
So can I add, just to wrap up to Susan's questions about the statistics? I think it's important to get statistics, but I also think it is very important, like Deborah and Robin has mentioned, put a face to those numbers. So what do these numbers tell us? And numbers are numbers. We can crunch any numbers we want, but it's important to put a face to them, to know the students' experiences, what they bring to the classroom, and how to leverage their assets to overcome their deficit, not always focusing on the deficits.
Thank you. So we're in our last minute, and I would like to thank you all for coming. And I'm just going to ask the panelists in 15 seconds to tell us one key point that they want to leave us with, just so that we end up with something in our minds to take away. So I'm just going to do it by how you appear on my screen. So Robin, you are first.
I think a key takeaway is to really remember the humanity of the students. Remember the humanity of the parents and the families, and to teach and to support in a way that is just not tunnel vision academics, but realizing the tremendous pressure and challenges that they're facing during this time. So just remember the humanity.
Deborah.
For me, the key thing is that I need to remember that students and their families have a lot to teach me and to teach all of us about how to navigate all of these changes to our world. And that when I take time to listen to them and value what they do know, what they do bring, then I can learn how to move forward as a teacher and as a human being.
Thank you. Gigi.
So my 15 seconds is to facilitate learning by understanding strength rather than deficits, and understand students as people and units of the society.
Thank you. And Catherine.
I would say that to complement a focus on humanity of the kids and their families, we also have to think about the teachers who are struggling the most here in a way. And that one very useful role for National Academy is to highlight the resources that would support teachers. And I'm thinking primarily, of course, of good curricular resources that do exactly what everybody's talking about. Start with issues that are central to the students' identity, as a result are highly engaging for them, but that they can enter at different levels, at different literacy levels, and engage with in their own unique ways.
Perfect. Well, I'm sure this is just the beginning of a very long conversation, and I hope we have lots of luck in moving forward and supporting the students as they come back to school or as they are virtual this fall. Thank you.